because that's a good summary of what we spoke about last session.
Okay. So then just to pick up on that, Rob, in terms of where we got to, I think in the last session, I think it was a consistently held concern, one that we've talked about before, but a concern that the work health and safety framework is not really an appropriate framework for managing a lot of these issues around psychosocial health. When we were talking before we came on air, we think there is a genuine concern that people will have about reporting psychosocial concerns in the workplace if it has to be reported to the health and safety regulator, because they don't want to be part of that investigative process. And as we touched on, I think both the regulator and most organisations simply lack the expertise and pastoral care to properly manage this as an issue. But I think, and we'll probably where we move to today or this evening is, there is certainly a recognised mechanic, an expectation from the regulator about certain processes that need to be in place, certain things we need to demonstrate we do as an organisation to comply with these new frameworks under the legislation. But then, and just Nippin and Rob, I think this is more in your area of expertise. It's one thing to say we're going to have a process of investigating and reporting or setting up systems. It's quite another thing to have the expertise to execute that properly.
Yes.
And that's not to say that's, if we look at the world of work health and safety or safety and risk more broadly, that's a universal concern. That's not a concern that's limited to psychosocial risk. We have lots of people going and doing inspections and having conversations in the name of health and safety all the time that aren't properly equipped to execute that role. But it just strikes me that in the case of psychosocial harm, the capacity to, or psychosocial risk, I should say, the capacity to do real harm because you don't have the right level of education and training, it's a real threat, I think.
Yes. And I'll just give an example of one form of harm before we go into the topic of what could be done. But in all of my education and several majors in several degrees in both pastoral care and clinical psychology, the emphasis on confidentiality is absolutely paramount in any of the professionals who deal with psychosocial issues, mental health, and so on. And so it goes without saying to any social worker, counsellor, community worker, youth worker, clinical psychologist, psychiatrist, the fundamental foundation of any counselling session is this will not go outside of this room. There will be no names. There'll be no naming of condition. There'll be no reporting. And so therefore you can reliably know that this is confidential. And so that is the direct opposite of what everyone in risk and safety is told, that if you get information, you must report it. If you receive anything that you think is a risk or a hazard, and that's what the documentation says, it has to be reported. Now, recently I had a 28-year-old young woman who was seeking counselling for sexual harassment in the workplace. And we have the same obligations as any of the states to report these hazards to the regulator. The first bit of advice I gave her was to tell no one. That was the first advice I gave her. She continued with the counselling sessions, and her best choice was to resign her job, which she did. She left her place of employment. We continued counselling, and I slowly saw her improve. Her stress levels improved, her distress improved. She saw her doctor several times. She's on medication, but that also improved because she left the workplace. I know that if she was asked to report the nature of that sexual harassment to her employer, she would have had a breakdown.
Yep. I mean, it's not fair. It's pragmatic, but it's not fair.
Yep. And so my advice to anyone having worked in employee assistance programs for a number of years, in the largest one in Australia, actually, everyone knows if a big company like Woolworths or Coles or Wesfarmers pay an outside provider to provide employee assistance counselling, that the only data the employer gets is that a counselling session was undertaken. They don't know the employee. Sometimes they don't even know the location of the employee. They only know that an employee's been seen. That's it.
And
so here's, sorry.
Sorry, Greg.
I think those services will continue to operate like that, and those services will continue to be a part of this broader psychosocial picture.
I hope so.
I absolutely think they will. But what has historically been the case, for better or for worse, and I think there's a tension here. For better or for worse, there has been a discretion within employers when people want to make complaints about any sort of psychosocial concern, not to make it public, not to have to deal with it if the complainant doesn't want you to.
Yep.
Now, I think there are arguments at one level that the pendulum, certainly if you look at the Enough is Enough report in the West Australian mining industry and sexual misconduct there is an argument that can be made that there was too much discretion and they allowed that to manifest. But then to take the pendulum the other way and say you kind of lose any discretion around that, and if it's brought to your attention or you witness something, it's got to drop into the normal work health and safety sort of flow.
Yeah.
I think has swung it too far the other way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So to what I'm hearing from the two of you, at least from Rob, is that what we are applying to psychosocial risks is exactly the same mechanistic approach that we apply to safety reporting systems. And hence it does not work and it will not work. And I think what Greg, you were trying to say is that yes, but there is always that discretionary approach. You don't really apply although there is a mechanistic approach, you don't really apply it exactly in the same way. There is a level of discretion that comes through.
No, that's what's changed. I think by dropping it into the WHS framework, that level of discretion is much more problematic.
Yes.
Much more. So you deal with cases often where they say we're just trying to deal with this as best we can, and you say, well, if this comes to the regulator's attention and you haven't told them, they're going to come down on you.
Yep.
So there's a tension there that's not easily resolvable.
Yeah.
Can I add? Sorry, Nippin.
No, go for it.
I want to add another problem to this, and we've spoken about employee assistance program and outsiders of professionals outside of organisations. One of the things that bothers me the most about the risk and safety industry is its exclusivity about what it knows and its disrespect for professions outside of itself. Psychobabble. We discredit psychology. We discredit anthropologists. We discredit people like me who have expertise in pastoral care, social psychology, and ethics. I mean, I've lectured and supervised masters in ethics at all sorts of levels at university, and I get dismissed constantly because I raise ethics as an issue, and even Greg will know he would have done it in his first year at uni. You would have had to have done ethics, Greg, as your education pathway.
Yeah. To give that a bit of context, I mean, legal ethics are professional ethics, which are slightly different because they're codified in the legislation. So it's a different ethical obligation than if I'm a counsellor, but it's part of the profession.
I agree, but I would add to that, in a general sense of ethics, where we talk about moral philosophy, that is also within the bailiwick of legal ethics as well. But when you and I are talking about this, Greg, you know how much a risk and safety person does in ethics?
No, it's not.
Yeah, doesn't exist.
No.
And they're now talking to a clinical counsellor who comes to them and says, you know, we will keep complete confidentiality of this issue, and it won't be reported to the regulator because it will be a breach of that confidentiality. And now you've got a conflict between two legal obligations: the legal obligation of the clinical counsellor, even worse if it's chaplain, and then you have the demand of the regulator saying, oh, you must report. So the nightmare that they've created is a moral dilemma for the risk and safety industry, not just a idea of, well, it's a hazard and we go through some sort of, 4-stage management process. It's a major, major issue. If I was a clinical counsellor seeing someone under a sexual harassment process in an organisation, the first thing I would not do is tell the regulator or tell the organisation anything of what I knew. It's the first thing I'd do.
And of course, the compounding thing here is even if organisations use their best endeavours to preserve confidentiality, just the fact that they have to investigate is almost inevitably going to compromise confidentiality, because you can't.
Absolutely.
You can't mean. And if you're a person who's been accused of having done something, and you say, and they don't give you any information that enables you to answer the allegations that have been made against you, the process is silly. But again, there's a balance here, because I'm very conscious of the power imbalance often between perpetrators and victims, which allows perpetration to go on.
Absolutely.
And I'm not just in the context of sexual misconduct, right? Bullying, harassment. There's a whole range of things that happen in the workplace that fall far short of what most people think of as serious incidences that have a cumulative effect over time. So if you say it's got to be, the discretion and the preservation has got to be there, that's fine. But it does create an environment where inappropriate behaviour can go unchecked. But then at the other end of the spectrum, if you mandate certain processes, it has the potential to harm people further and certainly drive reporting underground. And that's my biggest concern in this whole issue, is we haven't created a framework, and maybe there isn't one that exists, but we haven't been able to steer a middle ground which creates an environment that can protect people.
But you see, I think that's because professionals in the caring professions have been not consulted enough in the framing up and the creation of this whole legal and regulatory process. I think they've been left out, and they've put it in place now, and now they're trying to bring them in as Johnny come lately.
Is there an issue though, Rob? I'm interested in your view that the primary concern of the caring professional is the well-being of the person that they are looking after.
Absolutely.
So that's their primary concern. Whereas what the legislature is trying to do by enforcing this stuff through work health and safety is broader than the well-being of the individual. And that creates a tension.
Yes, it does. But if you read the Australian Institute of Health and Safety chapter on ethics, it very clearly states that the purpose of work health and safety is duty to safety, not duty to the person. It's very clearly stated that the risk and safety industry, its whole purpose is the duty to the outcome of safety rather than duty to the outcome of a person. Indeed, the words person, care, and helping and the word power are not used in that document.
Yeah,
No.
I think, Greg, you and I had a discussion in Perth before I left. And one of the things we spoke about was the idea of what is safety. And I think a lot of it is I think Rob comes from a perspective of helping and caring, which is very person-centric. Whereas the dominant view of safety hasn't changed, and it probably will take a long time for it to acknowledge the fact that people are an important aspect of safety. It's very mechanistic still in the way it is understood and applied.
Yes.
Yeah,
I wonder if there'll be some precedences in court cases that eventually where an individual feels abused by an organization due to the process put in place by safety, and they'll prosecute the organization as being harmed by the process. I'm wondering if that happens.
Well, we already have that in the context of disciplinary action.
Yeah, but there's something. Yeah, sorry. I think, Rob, that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is something like what happened in the Me Too campaign. That something blows out of proportion completely, and that creates so much problem for the organization, and it is turned not that reputation is at stake. And I think that's where you see something happening in this space. But most of the times, I think even the HR and law is to protect the organization, not the person, most of the time.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. The moment there's any challenge within is we close ranks, we defend the organization, we defend our systems, we defend our methods, and that's often at the expense of, and like I advise this young woman, just leave the organization. It will cost you too dearly emotionally and morally, just leave. And that was my best advice. And so unfortunately what happens then is the perpetuation and the repetition of the sexual harassment will stay in that organization because it wasn't reported. But the opposite is too harmful to the individual. So you just allow, it's like the perpetuation of sexual assault in churches. You send it underground, it goes secret, and you just damage more people.
And of course, it's not, I know we're focused on a bit, but none of this is limited to sexual misconduct. No. There's the bullying and the harassment. And
yeah, that's right. I raised the sexual harassment stuff because there is so much of it now coming out from the regulators with all this kind of systemic rubbish, which is just incredibly harmful, like that recent alert that came out in my jurisdiction. And I just think if a psychologist or a counsellor was just even consulted once, that document would not look anything like it did.
Perhaps if we think that we have had a good discussion on this, maybe we should go on to the second concern that Greg raised, or even you raised, Rob, which is around the competence or the expertise to actually recognize these issues in the first place in the organization. Maybe we should talk about that as well.
Yes, yeah. It was interesting when I was working in Beaconsfield during the rescue, there were 210 staff. Many people were traumatized. There were 800 external contractors brought in for the rescue. So we had over 850 people involved in the rescue, with dozens and dozens of people severely traumatized. how many people do you think on that 850 people had any expertise in pastoral care?
That would
One.
be surprising.
There was one.
But Rob, I think it's much bigger than the risk and safety world. I think it's the part of the problem of being in an organization. I think that's what organizations are about. I don't know, maybe interested to hear Greg's view on this.
Well, I mean, in part, and in part, it's the structure of the legislation that I think drives a lot of the behaviour you're concerned about, Rob. So you have a structure of legislation that says you have to understand the activities of your business, you have to understand the things that can cause harm arising from your activities, so the hazards. You have to assess those hazards, you have to develop controls, you have to implement and enforce. So when you overlay that on something like psychosocial risk, they say, for example, workload contributes to stress, so you have to do something about that. You have to have proper grievance procedures. You have to have proper performance development processes. You have to have an EAP or some sort of process. You have to have a complaints procedure. You have to have a grievance procedure. You have to provide training to people on behaviours and conduct. You need to have policies and procedures. And so all of the artifacts of health and safety have simply been aligned around what people believe causes psychosocial risk. Now, some of those beliefs may be well informed, some of those beliefs may be less well informed.
Yep.
But ultimately, this is when I talked about the issue, Nippin, that you're touching on about the ability to recognise and deal with those things. From a legal technical compliance perspective, the problems are no different than physical safety, in the sense that if a person who doesn't understand the physical risks associated with the type of work creates the process to manage it, it's probably not going to be effective for the people who have to do the work. If people who don't understand the issues around psychosocial risk and they're simply copying from a regulator's code of practice, then those systems are probably not going to be useful either. And then you have to overlay that, so that you've got your mechanic, but then you have to overlay that with your implementation, and people have to implement the processes. And if our people aren't competent, experienced, whatever we need to implement the procedures, then we have a problem. And it's not a new problem because of the regulations. We've got years and years and years of workers' compensation claims built around management action, whether it's disciplinary action, transferring people, terminating their employment. So we're not suddenly waking up in this brave new world saying we've got
we've made it worse.
Yeah, yes, we've made it worse. We know what the problems look like.
Yeah.
We know the sorts of harm that can be done to people, and we've seen that through HR and workers' compensation over the years.
Yeah.
But instead of saying, here's a once in a generational opportunity, given everything that was kind of coalescing at the same time, to think about, is there a better way to regulate for this across a whole range of areas? What we've just done is not even slap work health and safety onto it, because it's always been there. We've suddenly put it into the spotlight. Yeah. And so now we've got multiple different parts of our organisation, parts of our legislatures, of different regulators all over the place, all responsible for this thing that we can't kind of put a fence around called psychosocial risk.
Yeah.
And I think we have made it worse.
Absolutely.
I mean, just listening to both of you, I think what we are mostly driven by, whether it's in regulation or in business, is fear and control. And I think that fear and control is not letting us to actually listen to the concerns of people. Although if we did listen with a little bit of patience, it'd probably do much better things, both for the organization and as well as for the people. But the immediate instinct, as soon as you hear somebody being bullied or sexually harassed, is what do I do now to control this issue? And I think that fear and control actually makes it much worse. And then, so in terms of, now we're talking about building expertise, I think that expertise does not exist in most organizations, which is to first listen before you do anything about it. We are so busy, and I think we've been doing a lot of work together, Rob. I think it's so much in the genes of the organization to fix every problem before understanding it. And I think that's one of the big problems I see it.
Yeah. I wrote a very long article, how long ago? 15 years ago. And it was simply a question: isn't it time we reformed the safety curriculum? I presented it at an Institute Health and Safety conference, got howled down by mostly engineers and, behaviorists. I simply raised the question. Now, the funny thing is, since I wrote that paper, there's been no change at all in the work health safety curriculum. And it is the same, not just in Australia, but the US and other countries. And there's no question raised like that still, even though we've brought in psychosocial issues. And I would have thought that the industry, particularly practitioners, would be screaming out by now, saying that everything that you've got in the work health safety curriculum, everything, does not help me at all deal with this issue. And my argument would be, I don't care whether you drop one subject, two subjects, or three subjects out of the current curriculum, but you've got to do something for the preparation of work health safety people to enter into a workplace, into this minefield. They've got to have something, even if it's just 101 foundations in people helping, or 101 foundations in moral conduct and ethics. I don't care what it is, but no one is asking for it, Nippin. And so, we've got these advisors coming out, and it's like in Rose's book, we are basically preparing them to get abused.
Rob, absolutely. Such a good point. I think if you just forget about being too sophisticated about it, just thinking about the kind of questions that we raise even during investigations and audits, there's absolutely no regard for the person. It's always about the mechanistic systems. And actually, if just look at the questions that you ask, just the first question that you ask when things go wrong with people, there is no appreciation for the holistic understanding of the problem. It's find a problem, fix it. That's it.
Yeah. My very first question is, who is traumatized? That's my first question.
And my question as an investigator would be, why did you do it this way? Or why didn't you do this?
Yeah. And if I'm a professional counselor on a work site and I've got 3 traumatized people, the first thing I'll be advising them is to talk to no one.
It's a difficult one, Rob, because, I can only talk from my experience that if it happens in the maritime world, the first thing that the client demands for is a report. So it's not just the regulator, it's also the client demanding for a report, which should be designed exactly in the same way the safety report.
I'd like to ask Greg about this. Greg, if a person gives evidence under duress in the moment, when they come to court and they say, I gave that evidence under duress, does that absolve them of that, particularly if they had a psychiatric report?
It doesn't. It's not a question of absolving, but it's a question of how much weight gets given to the evidence.
Yep.
And the circumstances. So if you give a version of it, so there's been a traumatic event, you're interviewed at the time of the event, you give one version of events, you interviewed 48 hours later, you give a different version of events.
Yes.
Trying to work out which version of events has more, bearing in mind, we're trying to work out which version of events has more credibility 5 years later, which is problematic in itself. So,
yeah. Again, that's the same conflict of duty to the process or duty to the person.
Well, yes, and I think we kind of touched on this last time, more in a HR context, but this idea of there's nearly always in all of this, Rob, at some point in my experience, and it's earlier or later in different organisations and different circumstances, where the process it kind of literally gets triggered, right? And the way I see it manifest itself most commonly in the name of psychosocial is not as a safety issue, but it's kind of, that's where we're heading historically in a HR issue, is when somebody comes and talks to their manager and says, I have a concern with the behaviour of my supervisor or the behaviour of my co-worker. Now, very often in a HR context, that conversation could be had and we can work through ideas until the point it becomes an official complaint under the grievance procedure, and then the process takes off.
Yes.
And once the process takes off, I think that's when individual well-being gets lost. Yes. So I'll give an example. Similarly, I was involved in a fatality on a mine site some years ago now. Once the inspectors are on site, you will have people running around trying to get counselling for the people involved in the incident. There's a group of people out here who are genuinely trying to look after the interests of individuals, but then there are a group of people, and I'm sort of in that secondary group working with the regulator, who's trying to get people through the process as effectively as possible. Yep. And we had there was a fatality where the regulator was on site, and at one point they demanded that, so we'd flown 2 counsellors up to site, because there was 2 contractors involved and they both had their counsellors. They demanded to see the counsellors' notes of their counselling sessions with the people, so that they could form the view about whether they should be able to interview them while they're on site. Now, the counsellors gave that very short shrift, as you can imagine.
Oh yeah.
And so that eventually went away. But that difference between process versus the genuine care, is it, and it's very easy to be very unsympathetic to regulators in those circumstances, but you have to recognise that if I'm an inspector on site, I am subject to the power dynamics of the organisation as well. I've got to get things done. Yeah. So it's never as black hat and as white hat as we would like to believe it. Everybody's operating under really difficult scenarios.
Yeah. So here's a question. Here's a question for both of you. I think we are just coming to the end of it, but here I am. I'm an employer and I'm looking for some help in this area. What would you say to me? Where should I go now after listening to both of you over the last half an hour or so? What's my position? What should I be doing now?
Can I go first? Because my answer is a bit more straightforward, in that as an organisation, you have an obligation to the organisation as well as your people, and so you need to have demonstrable structures in place. You need to say, this is what we've done to think about the way we run our business. We've gone to the code of practice. We've recognised that these are the sorts of things in businesses that cause harm to people's mental well-being, and this is what we've done to try and address it. That's what I would be saying. You need to get your structures done. You need to have your structures in place. And then I would defer to experts in the field to say, how do you make those assessments about those structures, and how do you actually deliver against those structures, which is much more in Rob's field than mine.
It's interesting, Greg, that so much of the Work Health Safety Act and regulation is consumed with consultation. It's amazing how often that word comes about.
Yep.
Except the moment we move into this area, I would argue that one of the first things Nip and I would do is I'd say, you need to get a balance of the professionals that are a part of this process. Yes, I agree with Greg. You have to have demonstrable processes, but it can't be a demonstrable process administered by engineers. You know, you need a collection, a dialogue between the professions and across the professions in order to get a balanced decision. So an executive director doesn't just listen to a geologist or a safety advisor for their opinion on something, whether it be a fatality or testimony or whatever, but that in the end, it will be the CEO or the general manager who actually has to come and make a decision. But that can't be based on an imbalanced approach to the issue. And I think if we want a balanced approach, I would either put on staff a professional, or I would make sure that I had even a number of professionals who would be brought in any complex case, and they would be part of the consultation process. Regardless of what the outcome is, at least the CEO could say, we consulted appropriate professionals.
I think there is a genuine concern in industry at the moment, probably more particularly in small and medium-sized enterprises. They don't know who they can turn to. And we're seeing, and the whole marketplace is being flooded by now everybody's an expert in psychosocial risk. Well,
okay, great. Is there anything else either one of you wants to say before we leave?
I think if we are going to do something, for God's sake, I think we must look at how we prepare these people to start their career in safety. We've got to start looking at, why would you send someone into a minefield with no education at all in any of this? Now look at the three of us. Look at our life experience, our years in the game, our education and our years of education and expertise, our practical experience in real life and real life situations. You think of this, of a young person coming into the risk and safety world with the current curriculum, and we're virtually setting them up to get smashed in the first couple of months they're out in the workplace.
Apparently, Rob, there is an industry out there which believes that you can sort most of these things with a checklist.
Yes.
And,
A template.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
I know someone who wrote a book called Paper Safe, you know. I know someone who wrote a book called Paper Safe, and I reckon everyone should bloody well read it.
I think that's a good end. That's a good end to this conversation.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Nippin.
All right.